Good evening and welcome to the 10 Mile River Scout Museum Presents. I'm Michael Drillinger, chairman of the 10 Mile River Scout Museum. And because of the COVID pandemic this summer, the museum has been presenting a program of virtual talks. In fact, tonight is our last talk for the 2020 season. So I'm really glad that you're here with us and I hope you enjoy. The 10 Mile River Scout Museum is located at the headquarters area of the 10 Mile River Scout Camps. The 10 Mile River Scout Camps is a 12,000 acre reservation located in Sullivan County. The reservation, the first camps opened in 1927. The reservation was made possible by the work of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and other prominent New Yorkers in the late 1920s. The Tmr Scout Museum was started in 1997 and is dedicated to preserving the history and artifacts of the 10 Mile River Scout camps and the local area. The museum is unfortunately closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but you can take a virtual tour of the museum if you go to museum.org/historian. And if you have any questions, you can call the museum at that number. The platform we're using to deliver these presentations is GoToWebinar, and somewhere on your screen will be something that looks like this. There'll be a section there in this control panel labeled questions. So if you have questions during tonight's presentation for our presenter, please feel free to type the questions in the question box, and our presenter will get to as many of them as we possibly can at the end of the presentation. Also, at the end of the program, there'll be a brief survey, and if you wouldn't mind sticking around and taking the survey, we would appreciate that. The whole program will be available on our YouTube channel in about 3 days if you want to relive every scintillating moment, or if you want to share it with friends who couldn't make it to the live broadcast. There are several ways that you can interact with the museum using social media. There's, of course, our webpage I mentioned, tmrmuseum.org. We're on Facebook. You can look for TMR Museum. We have a Twitter account. And as I mentioned before, we have a YouTube channel. Search for 10 Mile River Scout Museum and look for our new virtual museum tour, as well as many other interesting programs related to 10 Mile River Scout camps. Here again is the museum phone number if you have any questions, or you can email questions@tmrmuseum.org. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at chairman@tmrmuseum.org. We offer these programs free to the general public, but we do incur some cost in producing these programs. And if you're so inclined and you'd like to donate to support future programming, you can visit tmrmuseum.org/donate. Tonight is my great pleasure to bring back Glenn Pontier. Glenn was the co-director of the TMR Museum in the 2019 summer season. And he was one of our first presenters when we first began these programs back in June with a wonderful presentation of the timber industry, as well as rafting the logs down the Delaware River in the late 1800s. Glenn is very active in Sullivan County. He's held a number of prominent jobs around the county, including the director of the Fly Fish Museum, as well as Sullivan County Rising, I think it is. And as I said, he was a co-director of the 10 Mile River Scout Museum. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Glenn Pontier.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and hopefully you can hear me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Native American or the indigenous people that lived in this area where 10 Mile River Scout Reservation is. And I should start out by saying that I am not a indigenous person. My grandmother came from the Netherlands back at the turn of the from the late 1800s into the 1900s. She was from the Netherlands, from a little North Sea island. And my family is Dutch, but I've lived in this area for a long time. But the people that lived here originally called themselves the original people, and they were the Lenapi Indians. And they're known by several names, but they lived all throughout New Jersey and across the Delaware on the eastern Pennsylvania, up the Schuylkill River, up the Lehigh River. They lived across the Hudson River in New York and down and on what is now New York City and Staten Island and a large part of Long Island. And they were an interesting tribe of people. And we're going to talk a little bit about where they came from and how they viewed themselves. And if you know much about early American history, you know that there were two large groupings of Native Americans or indigenous people. There were the Iroquois that spoke a relatively common language and had a political confederation, first of 5 and then 6 tribes, the Iroquois, the Oneida, and then there were the Algonquin, which was not so much a political confederation, but more a cultural and linguistic grouping. And if you remember, the Algonquin were allied with the French, and the Iroquois were aligned with the British. The Lenapi Indians were part of neither of those political groupings. And they were, in fact, they were considered the ancestor tribe of both the Algonquin and the Iroquois. And they, as I said, they lived in this area of New Jersey. They divided themselves into 3 clans, and there were the Mincy or the Wolf clan. There was the Turtle clan, and there were the Turkey clan. And while they each had a kind of general geographic area, they intermixed so that in a village you would find 2 or 3 clans represented in any village. They called themselves Lenape, and we know this because a woman named Touching Leaves, and we're going to talk a little more about her later, who spoke Lenape. She was the last full-blooded Lenape woman to live, and she taught the language. When I was a child, we called the Indians of New Jersey the Lenape, but they pronounced it Lenape. But the British called this Indian grouping the Delaware Indians, named after Lord Delaware. And so they identified this group of indigenous people with their own name. Today, the Lenape, some of them use the name Delaware, and it came to be something that they accepted, or many of them accepted, some of them didn't. So as they lived in this area, there are a couple of things that you need to know about them in order to really understand how they existed as um, indigenous people. And that's a phrase that yesterday was Columbus Day in most of the country. In parts of the country, it's known as Indigenous Peoples Day, because America or this land wasn't discovered by Columbus. There were as many as 100 million people that lived here in North and Central and South America. There could have been as many as 50 or 100,000 Lenape Indians. But because they lived along the Jersey Shore, and if you're familiar with the Jersey Shore, you'll know Long Beach Island or Cape May or that area. They did a lot of fishing, and the Lenape were not known as great warriors, as the Mohawk were. They weren't known as great fur traders, as many of the Algonquin tribes were, but they were known for their fish and for their shell and beadwork. And the beadwork was something that if you live in a seacoast area, there's lots of shells. And they became masters of the beadwork and decorated their own clothing with the beads. So much so that when the first Europeans saw them, they compared some of the gowns and the clothing that the Lenape wore with the fine lace work that was done in Belgium or the Netherlands or places in Europe. So one of the interesting things about the Lenape was that it was a woman-run society. And this happened in several ways. In one way is that the Lenape didn't in general own the land. They didn't think of it as individually owned. There were areas that tribes or clans claimed as their own, and the land was held in common. But a person would have a house or a little hut that they lived in, and they would have a garden plot. And these were controlled by the women. The women stayed at home, they gave birth, they raised the gardens, they were in charge of the village life. The men went off to hunt, sometimes on adventures, sometimes to war, but they were largely not in control of the village life. So that was one way that women were kind of in charge. Another way was that when a couple married, they joined the clan of the woman. So if a turkey and a turtle got married, if the woman was a turtle, they became turtles. If a wolf and a turkey got married and the woman was a wolf, they became a wolf. And then they lived with the woman's family until they could have their own house, their own dwelling. And so that was the second way that women were in charge, because they controlled the lineage. And the third way that the women were in charge has to do with the fishing and the shell making. Men fished, but women often fished. And women did a lot of the beadwork. So if your culture is renowned for its fish, its seafood, and its beadwork, and this is done by the women of the organization, then they become the providers in that sense. So economically, culturally, land-wise, lineage-wise, women were in charge. There were men that were elected or chosen to be the rulers or the leaders of the village and of the tribe, but the women could depose them. So it was a very accepting and progressive and equal society. People had different roles, but it wasn't one at the time that the Europeans came in the 1500s and 1600s and made contact with the indigenous people of the Americas, women were property. Women were owned by their fathers and passed on to the husbands. So you could see right away the difference in what life was like to be a woman in Europe at the time or to be a woman in the Americas at that time. Now, all the Native American tribes weren't the same, but I'm talking about the Lenape. So most of the Lenape lived in the individual dwellings. This is a recreation of one from a site in New Jersey. This is a depiction. Sometimes they lived in what would be called longhouses, and they occupied a section of the house, and maybe a relative or a close friend would operate in the next section. I want to talk about how the Lenape kind of came together as a society because it's fascinating. And it's fascinating because all of us recognize that there's a pivotal age. You're born and then you go through adolescence and you change from a child to an adult. And the Lenape had a way of helping young people transition from childhood to adulthood that strengthened the culture and the community. And it was called a vision quest. And this is, I think, a poor depiction of it because as I explain the story, it's going to be a little more complicated than someone out waving a feather at the sky. But the idea was, and the idea was that when a child reached adolescence, 12, 13, maybe 14, they would wake up one morning and their parents would throw them out of the house. They would shun them. They would tell them they would be ornery and angry with them, and the child would know it was time to leave. Now, because they grew up, they'd seen it happen to their older brother or their older sister or someone else, their cousin, and they knew that this was the time when the child was expected to go out and to walk through the woods and to return to or find a place where they felt comfortable, a place that they liked. And for some children, maybe it was a field. They loved being in the middle of the field and watching the deer come in. For another child, maybe it was sitting up on a bluff, on a cliff, overlooking a river underneath. Or maybe it was under a big tree. So a child would go to a place where they felt comfortable, and they were expected to sit there and to observe the animals and the world around them, because the Lenape were a spiritual people, and they believed that the animals were helpers to people, and animals needed to be respected, but animals could also help you. They were kind of a way that the great spirit of life talked to people. So a child would be out in the woods. Now, a couple of things. You were expected to fast when you were out there. You didn't take a bunch of food with you. You went out on your own. You came to this place and you hung around for a couple of days until you had a vision. But remember, you're 11, 12, 13 years old, and you might not have a vision. You might be out there, and it might not. Nothing might move you. And so after a couple of days, you might come home, and your parents would welcome you back and say, "Hey, great, did you have a vision? Did you see anything? Did anybody speak to you?" And you'd say no, and they'd say, "Okay." And then a year or so would go by, and they'd kick you out again. You were expected to have a vision, to find meaning in life, but you didn't have to have it on your parents' schedule. You had to have it on your schedule. The girls also would do vision quests, not always, because often they had a more defined role. They knew that they were going to be in the village. But some of them went out on and had vision quests. Sometimes, if a child went out on a vision quest, somebody from the family would follow them to see where they were, to make sure they were okay. This wasn't an ordeal. It was a way to get in touch with yourself through nature. So you're out there and you're watching the animals and you see a hawk swoop. And for some young boys or girls, the hawk swooping, and maybe it comes down and it lands 5 or 10 feet in front of you, and you're just amazed by the coloring of the feathers, and it speaks to you, not literally the burning bush talking, but it has a meaning to you. Or maybe you're watching the grasshoppers hop in the field, and for some reason you just identify with it, or you see ants in a row, and the ants speak to you, or you see a deer come by, or maybe it's a bear and you're afraid a little bit, but you see the bear. It could be any kind of natural experience where there was a helper, a spirit that spoke to you. And what did it say? What does it mean? Well, when you came back, and here's another depiction of an older person kind of having that vision. And here's a picture of a young, looks like a boy out in a field. You can see he has a bow with him, so he's hunting. But this might be not dissimilar from what it would be like if you were out on a vision quest. So you would be out there, and you, one of those animals, the turkey or the tortoise or the beaver, one of them you would identify with. And then you'd come back, and you'd in the village, and you'd see the older men and some of the older women, and you'd go back to your mother, your father, and you'd say, you know, I had this, and your parents would say, no, don't tell us. Don't tell us what it is you saw. But do you remember that old man? Do you remember that man that, you know, you once carried a part of a deer for him that he couldn't carry? Or do you remember that old grandmother that when you were sick, you went to her and she made you this tea and you made you feel better? Go tell her, or go tell him what you saw. So the young person would go, and there was a ritual, and they would go to this this elder's dwelling and say, you know, grandfather or grandmother, could I see your medicine bag or your totem bag? And the Lenape, they carried a little pouch that they would keep some tobacco or some tea or some shells or something of value in, and the elder would hand the bag to the child, and the child would open it and stick a present in it, a little gift, maybe some tobacco or a beautiful stone or something that they had made, carved out of wood or something, and then they would give the bag back to the elder. And the elder, there were different kinds of bags. The elder would look at the bag and open it up and see the present and say, okay, so I understand you were out in the forest and you saw something. And the young child would explain to the elder what it was they saw and why it moved them. And the elder would then help the child interpret what that meant in terms of their own life. So if it was a bear, it might mean that the child was going to be a powerful hunter. If it was a grasshopper or an ant, it might mean that the child was going to look to small things, would find power in the little things in life. So the elder would take the child's experience and help shape it. And then the elder and the child would work together and would come up with a dance and a song and a secret name. And that name would not be told to anybody. And the dance would be a dance that would hint at what the helper was. So if it was an eagle, maybe the dance involved spreading your arms and flying about on the ground with your wings, your arm wings spread. Or if it was a rabbit, maybe your dance would involve hopping back and forth with your hands up like they were ears, rabbit ears. And you would chant a song that gave clues as to who your helper was and what your secret name was, but you wouldn't tell people. And then you would come back, and so you've had this experience, this adolescent life-changing experience that's been shaped by some of the elders, and then you would practice it. And people being people, you might tell your brother what it was and they'd help, or you might tell your aunt what your secret name was, and you weren't supposed to, but you might, and they might help you. And every year the Lenape had harvest festivals. They would celebrate. And this, of course, if you look at it, there's a tent over on the left. This is a more modern depiction of people perhaps identified as Lenape, a modern interpretation. But back at the time when indigenous people met with the Europeans, they didn't have some of those items. But they had traditions of dance and celebration, particularly at harvest time. And these celebrations might go on for 5 or 6 days or a week or more. And every night they would dance and sing. And the celebration started with what were called the tribal dances. And these were songs and dances that everybody knew. They'd been saying them or practicing them for years. So they would begin, and the tribal dance might be about the time of a great flood. And everyone would remember how, 80 or 90 years ago, there'd been this huge flood, but it had such an impact that the village had to move. Or it might be the time of a bad winter. Or of a great illness, or the time when they caught more deer to eat than they could eat, and they gave them away to neighboring tribes. These were dances that everyone knew in common. And then when they had danced the common dances, the oldest person in the tribe would get up and dance his dance or her dance. And since they were the oldest one, everybody else knew it. So it was kind of like a tribal dance, but it was that individual's dance. And then the next oldest, and then the next. And sometimes when a person would die, the tribe would dance their dance because to remember them. And then sometimes it would become a tribal dance. And sometimes they would forget one of the dances that they'd done, and it would be lost. So in this way, they had a common history that they renewed every year that included every person. Because by the last or next to last day of the festival, remember our young boy that went out and had his vision quest, and he was expected to dance his dance. Now, nobody had ever seen it before. He'd never done it. And so he would be a little anxious, and he would get up and begin to dance his dance. And as people understood what it was that he was saying, or who his helper was, or wanted to be supportive of him, they would get up and dance with him. So the elder that helped him shape the dance, they knew what it was. They'd get up and follow the boy. And maybe he'd told his brother and practiced the dance with his brother, so his brother knew. He'd get up. And maybe his mother, had a special way of interacting with her son and knew that he needed the support, so she'd get up. And slowly, people would come to understand him and his vision and his dance, and they would join in. Maybe it would take not that first year, maybe it would take several years before someone would know. Maybe someone's vision would change as they grew and matured, and they would have another kind of dance and helper, and that was allowed. So think about the sophistication of this, right? Here's a group of people that live in an area and have a way of integrating a young person into the tribe so that what they do and say and believe is important, but not as important as what the older people believe. But the older people are old, and slowly their ways go and the young people's ways come in, and it's all accepted as part of the tribe. Now, some people may, in fact, be think of the characteristics. You might get a young person that was not very smart. Maybe they were slow. Maybe they had what we call Down syndrome, or they had some kind of mental or physical disability. They were part of the tribe. They would have a dance. The people would accept their dance as part of the tribal ritual. Maybe somebody was gay. Maybe their helper and their dance reflected that. They were accepted as part of the tribe. Maybe somebody was a bully and people didn't really like them. And that person needed to be kind of dealt with. They were accepted as part of the tribe. And so this is an amazing, if you think about the way we integrate adolescents into our society, and of course, the Boy Scouts is a wonderful organization for taking young people and teaching them values and skills and integrating them into our society. And we have religious ways that we do that through confirmation for Christians, through the bar mitzvah and bas mitzvah for those who are Jewish. So we have kind of formalized rituals that we use. But we might miss, as a little aside, probably the most significant thing that happens to a young person in America today is that they get a driver's license, which gives them absolute freedom. You get in the car and you could be in Texas or California, and the power to take life. If you run someone over, or you travel too fast, life could end. Yet we have no real way of integrating that into our society. An interesting thought. I want to talk a little bit about Nora Thompson Dean, who was known as Touching Leaves. Both of her parents, she lived in Oklahoma. She was a full-blooded Lenapi Indian, meaning both of her parents were full-blooded Lenape. She later in life began to teach the language. She ran a company that made Lenape products, medicine bags and clothing, and she taught the dance. She became quite renowned. She came back to this area in the early 80s. Before she died, she wanted to see her ancestral homeland. She visited the Philadelphia area and New Jersey. She did come up the river. I was the editor of the River Reporter at the time. I never met her, but I remember her coming. When she died in 1984, her obituary was in the New York Times, also in the River Reporter. She was a remarkable woman, and she's the one who talked about how you pronounce the Delaware Indians, and it's not the Delaware Indians, and it's not the Lenape, it's the Lenape. There are 5 or 6 branches of the tribe now, all recognized. A couple of them are in Canada, some in Oklahoma, I think there's some in Minnesota. So you could, if you look up on Wikipedia or one of these places, you can get a good general background. There's some excellent books about the Lenape. And one of them, it's an old book. It's called The Indians of New Jersey, or Dickon Among the Lenape. And it was written by Mr. Harrington, who it's published by Rutgers University Press. He went on to become the curator of an Indian museum out in Los Angeles. This was written in the 1930s. There has been more scholarship done and anthropology that changes, kind of deepens what we know about the Lenape. At one time, the Lenape were believed to have had one of their tribal stories talked about them crossing the Bering Strait, and that they remembered it tribally hundreds of years later, generations afterwards. That's been kind of debunked as there's no real proof of that, although at one time it was believed that the Lenape believed that. The Lenape, as I said, were considered, they called themselves the original people. And there's some discussion of the tribal stories that the Mohawk and the Lenape together share in their culture. This book, though, talks about a young boy, Dickon, who falls off a colonial ship in the 1600s and is found by 2 young boys and an older man in a canoe in the Delaware River. And they pick him up and they take him to their village. And then it's his experience over the next 2 or 3 years as he learns how the Lenape live, what they eat, how they cook, how they make their shelters, how they make their clothing, how they hunt. And one of the things referenced in the book is how they make their pots. And if you're familiar with the 10 Mile River rock shelters, you'll know that in a couple of the rock shelters, there are little indentations in the ground, maybe the size of a plate, but cones, like a cone. And that's how the Lenape made their pottery. They would dig a cone shape in the dirt, and then they would press the clay in until they filled the hole for the bottom part of their pottery, and then they would take coils around to make it up higher. And so we know that's how the Lenape made their pottery, and we know that those holes exist in with the rock shelter. I think it's at Kiowa. So this is a fascinating book. There are many stories of and scholarship on the Lenape, but I'm not an expert on the Lenape, and I'm not an indigenous Lenape, but I would be happy to answer some of the other questions that people might have.
Thank you, Glenn. Great presentation. This is Mitchell, the vice chair of the museum, and I want to say thank you, Glenn, for an amazing presentation. And we have a few questions, and people, you're welcome to send in some more. Again, just look for the questions tab or the chat tabs. Either way we can work with, and you can ask your questions that way. On that note, why don't I start with the first question, which kind of a little bit of a statement / question, so I'll just read it out and see where we are. I know the Wolf clans were the Munsee or Mincy, and the Turkey clan were the Catagos. I think the third clan was the Turtle, and would that be Unami or another name, or am I wrong about the third clan?
You're right. It was the Turkey, Turtle, and Wolf, and I believe Unami was the third clan that you're referring to. Just an interesting thing about the clans. They're identified, and as I said, there were some villages that might be mostly wolf or mostly turtle, but you could have other people in the other clansmen in the tribe, in the village, and you might have all three. Or, they might not be equally spaced. There's some predominantly Turkey tribes, some predominantly turtle tribes. Although the Munsee did tend to live more in the northern part, so it would be more in this area. Although none of the Lenape lived actually where 10 Mile River is. The rock shelters were seasonal. They were summer. If you think about it, we go to the Jersey Shore in the summer, but it makes a lot of sense to go to the Jersey Shore in the winter, where it's not quite as cold as it is up here in the mountains.
Great. The next question jumps into the Boy Scouts, and we actually spoke about this during our rehearsal, and we could do it together maybe. Who decided from the OA to use Lenape as the Indians for the traditional foundation? If you're not totally familiar with it, I know parts of it, but maybe you know more.
I don't know that I know more. I do know that the depiction of the Indian on Indian cliffs that we use for the museum, for the badges, does not show a Lenape Indian. The Lenape didn't wear headdresses like that. Those were largely Plains Indians. One of the slides I showed Lenape, and they look more like how you would probably think of a Mohawk Indian or an Iroquois. But you probably better than I know how it is that the Order of the Arrow came to identify with Lenape.
Yeah, I could say from what I've read, and if anybody wants to, add to it, feel free to add in the chat room. But Erna Goodman, who founded it with Dr. Carol A. Edson, who were the founders or co-founder of it in 1915, they actually based a lot of it from The Last of the Mohicans, from James Fenimore Cooper. A lot of it is more based on the book versus the actual tribe. And there's been some discussion about that on the OA website and some other scouting sites. I'll leave it at that because I don't remember it all. So some of it is based, like I said, more on The Last of the Mohicans, which is an interesting but long book. But if you haven't read it, then of course there was the movie too.
Well, just let me add that when it comes to understanding the indigenous people, in Canada they're called something. We don't generally refer to the Native Americans as Indians. Some Indians do, but that was a misnomer based on belief that the early explorers had landed in India. So we tend to call them Native Americans or indigenous peoples or First Peoples, which is what they use in Canada. The Boy Scouts have had to go through a learning process. And if you've taken the Indian Merit Badge, you know that it's very careful to identify the specific traits and characteristics of Native American life with specific Indian tribes. And the days of using Plains Indian headdresses to refer to Lenape are gone. And the leading that recognition are the Scouts. But it took some time for the Scouts to get there. And originally, it was kind of a mishmash of both glorifying and misunderstanding what Native peoples were about. And but we've learned, and Scouting has learned, and as a country we've learned, and I think we have a much better way of presenting how the original people lived and what they offered to us and gave to us.
Great. We have a couple of questions that are all basically the same, so I'm gonna kind of take from all three of them, four of them, and just throw it at you. So here we go. How many people identify as Lenape today, and where are they living? And specifically, are any living in Canada or Oklahoma, or what other parts of the U.S.?
So Oklahoma, yes. Yeah, Canada, yes. I think it's Minnesota as well. I don't know how many people identify because, as I said, there's I think 5 federally recognized tribes. In order to be considered a Native American tribe, you need to meet certain criteria, and you need to be recognized by the federal government or the state government. So there are tribes in New Jersey that are recognized by the New Jersey government, but not by the federal government. And so I'm not an expert on this. If you Google it, you'll come up with you'll see some of the complications, and you'll come up with some of the answers. There is no organized Lenape presence living in the Upper Delaware, and not really any organized Lenape presence living where they originated from. There may well be individuals who are Lenape, whose heritage is Lenape, who live here. But in terms of living on a reservation or with a tribal government, there is a newly recognized tribe in the Ramapo Mountains in New Jersey that might be considered to be Lenape. It's a state recognized group. It's not a federally recognized group. But most of them, by the time of the American Revolution, the Lenape didn't live here. Philadelphia had been settled, New Jersey had been settled, up in this area it had been settled, and the Lenape had been pushed into Ohio. And then from there, they went further west and eventually either ended up in Oklahoma, which was Indian territory, or some of them went up to Canada. A lot of Lenape were converted by Moravian missionaries, and Moravians it's a branch of Christianity, kind of similar to Calvinists or Presbyterians, but maybe a little bit more like Quakers or so. But in that, it's not Orthodox or Catholic. And they sent missionaries here, and they converted a number of villages and clans. And so they are the ones that moved up into Canada. And during the Revolution, the Lenape they didn't exist in this area anymore, but I believe they fought on both sides. There were some for the British, and there were some that weren't. But the contributions in terms of Lenape culture are mixed and weak here in this area. In terms of names, a lot of names: Manhattan, Tapan. There are all kinds of Indian, Native American, Lenape names, but the lifestyle, of course, is long gone. And although interestingly, the Lenape had a game that they played, kind of similar to rugby or soccer, football, and they played between the men and the women. So this is another example of how the women were absolutely equal. One team would be all of the women, one team would be all of the men, and there would be a ball, and they had to push the ball from one side to the other, and the women were allowed to carry it, and the men weren't. And the women were allowed to tackle the men, but the men weren't allowed to tackle the women. So they evened out some of the physical differences between men and women. But it was a game that they played. And one of the slides that I showed, I put it in to show young people kind of practicing their dance, but it's really a slide showing them playing that game. You see, if you look close, you can see the little ball on it.
Great. And then the next couple of questions are similar again. So I'll pull from all 2 or 3 of them, and then we have 1 or 2 left, and then I'll turn it back over to Mike. So tell us more about the relationship between the Lenape and the Mohawk, since the Mohawk were such warriors and not viewed as friendly. And then were there any relations with the Lenape and the Ramapo? And many of us Kunitau campers from TMR may remember the Ramapo provisional troop, which actually your co-director Ira used to run for many years. So there we go.
Interesting. So the Ramapo, I'm not familiar with the Boy Scout Ramapo troop, which I think was an amalgamation of boys that didn't have a troop.
Exactly.
So, but the Ramapo Indians live in that part of New Jersey where the Ramapo Mountains are. And there are a group of people that live there that claimed ancestry back to the time of the Lenape. And it's hard now with DNA and genealogy. It might be possible to find out whether those people could trace their lineage back. But if you remember back when Elizabeth Warren was running for president, and she had grown up in Oklahoma and had always claimed that one of her ancestors was descendant from Native Americans. I think it was Cheyenne. And she conducted a DNA test, and there was a huge outcry. And in fact, it showed that the small percentage of her DNA was Native American. But if you listen to what the indigenous people said was, that's not the way we understand ourselves and our culture and our people. It's not through the DNA. It's through our culture and our heritage and our identification as Cheyenne or Arapaho or Navajo or Mohawk or Huron. That's what determines that we're in a tribe, not our DNA. And so the Lenape had an interesting situation where, and in the book, Dickin Among the Indians, he becomes a Lenape. But when the Lenape would capture somebody in battle, or they might raid a village of a tribe they didn't get along with, and they might take a prisoner, that prisoner then would live among them and could become one of them. And so they were naturalized. They became a naturalized citizens of the Lenape tribe, and were accepted in the same way that a native-born Lenape was. So it wasn't about the blood; it was about the culture, about the spirit. It's that spirit quest. It's that going off into nature and connecting with it and having it speak to you and internalizing the values. That's what made you a Lenape, not where you were born. And there are many, many instances of Lenape who captured or took a prisoner, or somebody becoming Lenape who started out as a Susquehanna or a Mohawk. And the Mohawk did the same thing. They would also adopt people irrespective of one's birth. But let me talk a little bit about the Mohawk Lenape relationship, because many years ago they put a sewer system in Narrowsburg, and in order to get federal money to do any kind of construction like that, you need to do an archaeological dig. So oftentimes government and business winks at this, and it's like, oh yes, sure, we'll check to see if there's any anthropological stuff we have to care about. So even though they were required to do a study of the archaeology they were digging up the flats and running sewer lines all throughout the town. So they had to check to see if they were disturbing a graveyard or something. So they hired what those people in the know would call a no-see archaeologist. And that's somebody you hire who's not going to find anything. Because if you find archaeological, then it's going to be more expensive. You're going to have to take out the artifacts, or you're going to have to go, or you're going to have to dig the trench line around the graveyard. So you hire somebody who's not going to find anything, and it's not good government, it's not good public policy, but it happens. And so in Narrowsburg, they hired a no-see archaeologist who, come to find out, couldn't ignore what he found. He found a major trading place between the Mohawk and the Lenape on the flats in Narrowsburg. So they'd spent years and years, these two tribes, meeting in Narrowsburg, New York, and trading. And now remember, what is it that the Lenape are trading? Seafood. They're bringing up all the food from the Jersey Shore, right, to trade to these, my God, lobster and oysters and clams and, swordfish and all the stuff they're bringing up. I don't know what it was exactly, and their beadwork. They're trading the beadwork. And what are they getting back from the Mohawk? They're getting the pelts and the hides that they can then trade with the British or the Dutch for, kettles and pots and axes. And they're also getting apples, because the Mohawk were renowned for their apples. I don't know. That's the some of the interaction between the Mohawk and the Lenape happened, and the artifacts that were found were then given to the town of Tustin, and they still exist. And someday, if there's ever money to put a museum up, these could be put on display, or maybe the 10 Mile River Scout Museum could get a hold of some of these artifacts because they show life from hundreds of years ago of the trading between the Mohawk and the Lenape.
That was great. I'd love it if our museum could. I think we'll go into the last round of questions, which again is similar, and we'll cover the same topic area. So I'll start with, some say the blockhouse at TMR, which we have on display at the museum from Kernighan, is not representative of blockhouse types found in the area. Any ideas of the difference? And then just jumping into a little bit kind of camp and the actual tribes. Kunita, which is part of 10 Mile River, means high in the hemlocks. Is that from the Lenape language? And where did they get Lenny in the Lenape?
So they got Lenny from Lenape means man or person. It means man in the way English man used to mean men and women, still does for some people. The masculine is used to represent both. Uh, if you're talking about Spanish-speaking people and it's Latina or Latino, the man represents both, even though it doesn't. So in Lenape, in that same way, Lenape means person, or in some cases, man. Although, as we've discussed, the women were kind of in charge on many levels. Lenny means original or first, or taken together, it's the original people. And again, that's what they called themselves. I'm not sure about the names that the scouts arrived, and so somebody else is going to have to address that. I don't know those things. The blockhouse is it's representative of the style. No one would have built a blockhouse like that. It's not big enough. But it's representative of the style of the kind of wood that was used. It was made out of logs. It overhangs so that when you're up, you're looking down. And if anybody tried to climb up it, they can't get over the overhang. So in that sense, it's not meant to be an authentic, like the cabin that's on the other side of the museum. That's an authentic, not just a reproduction, it's one of the cabins. But the blockhouse is kind of representational. So it's good as an educational tool. It's a fun place for kids to go in and take a look and understand that we didn't always have concrete, and aluminum and, vinyl siding and, buildings have changed.
Fantastic, Glenn. Once again, this was really exciting, and I thank you. And I am going to turn this back over to Michael to call it a wrap. Ready, Michael?
Well, and it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Actually, Glenn, it's been our pleasure, and I'm really, really glad that you could come back. And I'm really hoping that this pandemic is not with us next summer, but who knows? It'll be what it'll be. But thank you very much for a wonderful and interesting presentation. And as you know, I learned quite a number of things, and I hope others who participated similarly learn something new. Always learn something new when I spend time with you. Thanks again.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
I want to remind people that even if it is closed, you can take a virtual tour of the museum at tmrmuseum.org/historian, and scouts who take a virtual tour can earn the 2020 Tmr Museum Historian Patch, which features a no COVID logo for the first time. Along those same lines, we are offering this 6-inch commemorative patch that has the no COVID logo on it and the message, "We are all in this together, ain't it the truth?" You can purchase this patch at the TMR Museum store. If you go to tmrmuseum.org/online-museum-store. You should know that some COVID restrictions have eased up around Greater New York Councils. Scouts can earn the 10 Mile River Historical Trails Award. There have been a number of families that have come up and as families hiked either the 10-mile hike or the 14-mile hike or even longer, the full TMR trail, to earn the Historical Trail Medal. But you can also go hiking, day hiking at Camp Pouch and Camp Alpine that are open for scouts to day hike. But you should go to nycscouting.org/camping to get the details, because there are details. Once again, I want to make the shameless plea that there are costs the museum incurs in giving these otherwise free presentations. If you enjoyed Glenn's talk or any of the other talks, that you can revisit at the museum YouTube channel. Consider going to tmrmuseum.org/donate and contributing to future presentations. Again, here are the various ways you can interact with the museum on social media. There's our website, our Facebook page, our Twitter account, as well as our YouTube channel. And as I said earlier, this is our last virtual talk. So that said, there's only one last thing. Hopefully the Tmr Museum will open again in the spring, but if we virtual, you'll find out about it on our Facebook page or our Twitter account, or through your email. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great night.